Path of Exile 2 has been out for a couple days now. It looks great, boss fights are intuitive, skills are diverse, and the passive skill tree is just as expansive as PoE 1. But this game is far from perfect, and I'm here to discuss some of the more glaring issues the game currently has. So bear with me, and I promise there is light at the end of this tunnel. Let's get started. Melee can be incredibly clunky in Path of Exile 2. This game doesn't have the same issues that Path of Exile 1 has, but somehow it's created new problems for Melee that PoE 1 just doesn't have. When you start your Melee ability targeting a certain monster, your character will continue to chase that monster down if you hold the attack button. You can see this when the monster gets a red highlight. It's fine for abilities that you use once, since you just press the button once and the ability finishes, but for multi-hit combo abilities like Monk has, this turns into your character running around after monsters to attack, even if you have the attack while standing still checked for your ability. This might be a strike skills only problem for Melee, because slam abilities seem to be okay. There's another issue causing unnecessary pain points, and that is body blocking, which you can see here is when enemies are in your way and you just can't move them and they can't move you. Most of the time you have space to dodge roll, back, or to the side, but in some cases you are surrounded and there is nowhere to go. While this kind of interaction definitely makes the game harder, is it really fun to play against? I'd argue that we'd want to see a system where if you get surrounded, you have some option other than just spamming your ability and hoping that you don't get stunned before you escape. As it stands, getting surrounded is a death sentence for most people. I'm not sure if the dodge roll should have phasing, which means that you can dodge through enemies, or if we just need other defensive options when we get surrounded or cornered. I'd love to hear your opinions on whether or not body blocking is the problem or not, because as a Melee player, it feels like this happens to me frequently, almost every map, especially if I'm fighting in a map where I can't kill normal white monsters quickly. Now on to the currency. Currency works differently in Path of Exile 2 because in this game, each currency item can be used for some type of crafting, upgrading rarities, adding modifiers to gear, and more. Grinding Gear Games, GGG, have stated that they want players to craft during the campaign for their gear upgrades. I fully understand this point because having players craft their own gear is extremely satisfying. There's only one problem: barely any currency is dropping for players to craft with. Unless you get very lucky, spending an Exalt or a Regal Orb on your gear just isn't likely to give you a meaningful upgrade. Getting an Exalt every 3 maps isn't enough for players to experiment. Players should not feel like they are falling behind perpetually in gear. Most players aren't aware that the town shop resets every time a player levels up. I'm sure this knowledge alone would help some players, but it won't solve everything. Of course, you could always just trade in-game with another player for the gear that you want at just a fraction of the cost that crafting would take, but that doesn't really align with GGG's philosophy that players should be able to craft their gear reasonably well solo. Overall, I think that we need to see a little bit more crafting currency dropping and educate players that the shops reset on level up, and guiding them to take a look for any usable or craftable gear in the shops. On to the gems and skill system. The skill system is very interesting in Path of Exile 2. You get gems that turn into skill gems, which your character can equip. Every skill gem can be supported with various supporting skill gems, each adding different effects to the main skill. So for example, on my Storm Surge ability, I can add increased area of effect, or lightning penetration, or faster attacks, and more. This gives you a lot of freedom to be creative on how your character plays. There's just one catch: you cannot use the same support gem twice, even between skills. This means that if you want to attack faster with an ability, you can only do it with that one ability. This severely limits the creative freedom of certain builds. I understand GGG's perspective, that this restriction could create more diverse builds and force people to be creative in a different way. But in reality, this just confuses and feels restricting to new players especially. We'll see what happens when the full support gem list comes out. That should be when PoE 2 comes out of early access. Speaking of restrictive, Respecking your skill points is a very expensive task in Path of Exile 2. If you really mess up, it could cost you hours of grinding. I think the issue here isn't that it's impossible to grind for the gold, it's that it limits players from trying new things. Especially early, players want to test things out. Maybe you want freeze, or maybe you want shock. Maybe you want to scrap all the elemental stuff and go for pure physical damage. All these tests require respecking, and that gets expensive fast. I think that especially in the early game before level 30, respecking should be extremely cheap. Players just don't need a big restriction. It will just lead to people being afraid to try new things, and they'll be restricted to a build guide or something that streamlines their build just so that they don't waste gold or time to respec. I will keep this last section short and sweet because I think most people can agree that the monsters respawning every time you die in a map is way too punishing. You have just died, and after all that you have to walk back the entire way, especially if you don't have a checkpoint. I think the walk back is punishment enough for dying. The second issue I have is with the trial of Sekima and melee users. Namely, melee users who use armor specifically, because evasion can get away with a lot with the current honor system in the trial. Melee armor players have a really tough time compared to ranged players because you take honor damage every time you get hit. This issue is amplified even more if the player is using a Thorns build, because at that point, they can't even get hit to do the damage to enemies like their build is supposed to. Anyone who has tried the trial with a melee armor build will know how frustrating it is, especially when you watch evasion players avoiding most of the honor damage in general. Well, that's it for my complaints. Thankfully, some of these issues are being addressed through tweaks to the currency drops and gear drops for more powerful enemies, and they're actually changing the dodge roll to make it more forgiving. The future of PoE 2 is looking bright, despite all my criticism. I do love the game, and GGG has historically taken player feedback very seriously in PoE 1 especially, and they waste little time making appropriate changes. This is not like Diablo 4. Thank you for watching, and if you want to see more of me, I stream at twitch.tv/lpflea around 10 p.m. Eastern Time. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe to see more videos like this in the future, and feel free to leave any feedback for me about the video in the comments. This is my first long form video, so I am looking for any feedback at all. Thank you.